Okay, hi everyone. I'm Mary Crossland. I'm going to be talking about a mixed method study we conducted in eastern Kenya that focused on the impact of migration on sending households and specifically the impacts on rural women. So the work builds on a land restoration project that worked with over 2,500 farmers to conduct on-farm trials of promising land restoration options. And it was really through working with these farmers, the high numbers of women involved in the project, but also hearing women's stories about their increasing role as farm managers in the absence of men, that really kind of got us interested in taking a closer look at migration. So rather than looking to quantify or determine whether or not the feminization of agriculture is occurring, our focus was very much on how roles and relations within households might be changing in response to male outmigration. For example, how do patterns of decision-making, labour and capital change as a result of migration? And also, how might these changes impact I guess, kind of support or constrain investment in agricultural production. So to explore these questions, we used data collected from a household survey, which included a migration module. We also conducted focus group discussions with groups of men and women to get an idea of trends around migration, but also attitudes around the impacts on households with migrants. We also conducted in-depth interviews with women from households with migrants to get an idea of their kind of personal experiences and changes in their life kind of before and after a member of their household migrated. So first off, we wanted to get a better idea of the migration trends and patterns among the households we were working with. So who is moving, where are they going, how old are they, and what do they do? And so what we found was that most of the migration does seem to be male dominated, although not exclusively, but it tended to be male household heads or sons leaving to urban areas, so Mombasa, Nairobi and other towns. And they tended to be going looking for work such as guards, casual workers in construction, so non-agricultural employment. And they tended to return only for really a few days each month to visit the household. So rather than returning to help on the farm during peak periods. And instead they tended to send home remittances that would be used for hiring labour and investing in agricultural production. We also found that it was also perceived that migration, including that of women, had increased in recent years. And some of the reasons for this were increasing unreliable rainfall, poverty, and also land scarcity. And in light of this, households tended to discuss migration decisions together. And so it was often part of a household strategy that the household head or a son would go and look for work to support the family. And I think this kind of relates to that myth, if you like, around women being left behind or victims, passive victims of migration. So we found that women actually were sometimes very actively involved in the decision around migration. And especially when the son was migrating, they were even the ones paying for the bus fare or arranging the job opportunities in towns. So what did we find in terms of impacts for sending households? The greatest perceived burden was really the loss of farm labour and increases in women's workloads. And this is because they tended to take up activities that men used to do, such as ploughing and fencing. So women's kind of involvement in farming isn't just potentially increasing, but also the types of activities they're involved in might also be shifting, along with the kind of social norms around what is acceptable for men and women to do. It's also clear that remittances play quite a central role in determining whether a household perceives migration as being a net gain or a net drain. And also it strongly relates to the household's ability to offset that loss of labour. So if they have capital to pay for hiring labour and offset those labour losses. And yeah, over 90% of the households with migrants reported receiving remittances, and 80% of these reported that they were extremely important for their households. And while the remittances are often used for paying for food and school fees, they're also used for hiring labour and buying farm inputs, so improved seeds and fertiliser. We also see that migrant sons especially are sending home cash to buy livestock, but to also build themselves houses back home, and even purchasing more agricultural land, so presumably with the intention of moving back one day. It was also quite common for migrant husbands to return back and back to farming in their retirement. So even though male migrants might be kind of stepping out of agriculture, they're often still supporting and investing capital back into the farm that they might one day inherit or return to. And I think these findings really kind of highlight that dynamic nature of migration, and how migration might actually be a kind of extension of the household over geographical location rather than quite a clear separation. And we also see that in terms of decision making. So when looking at decision making, we found that most migrants, whether it's the household head or the son, are still involved in farming decisions to some extent over the phone. And that's often tied to the fact that they're the ones providing the capital, rather than, say, having knowledge or experience in farming that was valued necessarily. So it was often more of a kind of consultation, I guess, in terms of, oh, we need money for seeds this month. So it was almost a request for capital to support those farming decisions a lot of the time. And with the sons, it was almost seen as a kind of courtesy to involve them. So yeah, again, we're seeing that most migrants are very connected to their households. They're phoning daily, and even some sons were calling their mothers multiple times a day. So, but despite these kind of high levels of consultation and communication, women with migrant husbands did seem to have increased freedoms and control over farming decisions. So, for example, what to plant or where and when. And also generally, women were kind of perceived as being the most knowledgeable, engaged and interested in farming, since they're the ones kind of on farm, attending trainings, and have the most experience in agriculture. Migrants were also typically said to be very supportive of women's farming activities, encouraging their wives and mothers to attend trainings and learn about new innovations, and also were kind of entrusted with the day-to-day management decisions on the farm. But our findings also kind of highlight the potential dangers with equating women's greater autonomy and decision making with empowerment. So women's increased agency in farming decisions often came with increased workloads and responsibilities, but also emotional stress. So for instance, some women would talk about the strain of making decisions by themselves, and also the loneliness, especially when their husbands were the ones who had migrated. And conversely, in some cases where we saw that relationships with the spouse were very difficult, or there was a lot of conflict prior to the migration, some of these women kind of mentioned about how their lives had become more peaceful once the husband had moved away. We also saw kind of differences in the control over remittances, depending on whether these were sent to the mother or to a wife, and whether the wife was living with her in-laws or on her husband's land. So for instance, older women kind of receiving remittances from their migrant sons often had greater autonomy over how those remittances would be used, whereas say younger women who are maybe living with their in-laws still don't have their own land necessarily, have less kind of control over those decisions on how remittances are used. Similarly, depending on who else remains on the farm, migration can also be a challenge in terms of attending workshops and women's mobility, since someone always needs to be kind of on farm for security reasons. So what are some of the take-home messages from the study? I think that first, migration is quite a complex and dynamic process, and while we might talk about migration in terms of whether it's good or whether it's bad for a household, the reality is often isn't quite so simple. So you have multiple, often interrelated factors that kind of influence the situation of setting households and the women that remain. And the degree to which migration influences their access to labour, capital, knowledge, and also their involvement in decisions really varies with who leaves, who stays, and also the strength of those personal relationships with migrants that leave. So I think there's a clear need for, I guess, a more nuanced understanding of the diversity of migration, but also the situation of sending households, and how those migration dynamics might influence investment in agriculture. Second, that I think migration can be seen almost more of an extension of the household, in that households kind of find these synergies between migration and agriculture rather than seeing them as opposing strategies. So, for example, migration's often discussed as a household, and even though migrants might be working outside of agriculture, they're often still investing capital back into the farm. And finally, that we maybe need to be a bit careful around equating women's greater involvement decisions with, say, empowerment, while migration might kind of create those conditions for increased independence for women. It also tends to come with those increased workloads, responsibilities, and also emotional stress. So thank you for your time, and that's it from me. Thanks.